The silk dress I wore cost more than most people's monthly rent, but as I stepped into St. Michael's Cathedral, I felt like I was wearing rags. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, one of the youngest federal judges in the country, feeling small and insignificant in a room full of people who had spent years making me feel exactly that way. The Gothic arches soared above me, stained glass windows casting rainbow fragments across marble floors, but all I could focus on was the familiar knot of dread forming in my stomach. My cousin Marcus stood at the altar in his pristine tuxedo, beaming as his bride-to-be, Isabella, glided down the aisle in a cloud of ivory silk and French lace. The whole scene looked like something from a fairy tale, complete with 200 of our city's most prominent citizens witnessing what the society pages had already dubbed the wedding of the year. I had debated not coming at all, but family obligations die hard, even when your family has made it clear you're the obligation they'd rather forget. I chose a seat near the back, hoping to blend into the shadows, but my sister Victoria's voice cut through the hushed reverence like a blade through velvet. "Oh my God, Ava." Her laughter was bright and cruel, carrying easily through the sacred space. "Did you borrow that outfit? You look like a beggar who wandered in off the street." Heads turned. Whispers began. I felt the familiar burn of shame creeping up my neck, the same feeling I'd carried since childhood, whenever Victoria decided to remind everyone, and me, of my place in the family hierarchy. She stood 3 pews ahead, radiant in designer emerald that probably cost more than most people's cars, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the light from the chandeliers. Everything about her screamed success, wealth, belonging, everything I had never been allowed to claim in this family, despite achieving it on my own. "Seriously," Victoria continued, her voice pitched just loud enough for half the congregation to hear. "I thought we talked about this. Family events require a certain standard." Her friends giggled appreciatively, a sound like breaking glass in the holy space. I sat frozen, my hands clenched in my lap, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to flee. This was exactly why I'd avoided family gatherings for the past 5 years. This was why I'd built my life in careful isolation from the people who shared my DNA but had never shared my dreams, my struggles, or my eventual success. They knew me only as the family disappointment, the black sheep who had somehow stumbled through law school and presumably into some mediocre legal job that barely paid the bills. The murmurs grew louder. I could feel eyes on me, could sense the curious stares of people wondering who this inappropriately dressed woman was and why she thought she belonged among Boston's elite. My chest tightened, and I seriously considered standing up and walking out. Dignity be damned. Then Father Mackenzie, who had been preparing to begin the ceremony, suddenly stopped. His weathered hands gripped the pulpit, his kind eyes scanning the congregation until they found mine. The cathedral fell completely silent, as if even the ancient stones were holding their breath. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of decades serving this parish, ministering to the powerful and the powerless alike. Each word fell into the silence like a stone into still water. "Before we begin this sacred ceremony, I must ask that everyone show proper respect." His gaze moved deliberately to Victoria, then back to me. "We have the honor of hosting a distinguished member of our judicial system today. Please show appropriate respect for the Honorable Judge Blackwood." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Every head in the cathedral turned toward me, 200 pairs of eyes suddenly seeing me with new recognition. The whispers died completely. Victoria's face went white, then red, cycling through expressions of shock, disbelief, and something that might have been fear. "Judge Blackwood." The words hung in the air like an incantation, transforming me from family embarrassment to federal authority in the space of a single breath. I watched my sister's world tilt on its axis as she realized that the beggar she'd been mocking held one of the most powerful positions in the American legal system. Father Mackenzie smiled at me, a gentle, knowing smile that suggested he understood exactly what had just transpired. "Your Honor," he said with a slight nod, "thank you for gracing us with your presence today." I managed to nod back, my throat too tight for words. Around me, the congregation sat in stunned silence, the social dynamics of the room completely reversed in a matter of seconds. The woman they'd been pitying or ignoring was suddenly someone whose word could send people to prison, whose decisions could change lives, whose respect they desperately needed to maintain. But it was Victoria's face that held my attention. My sister, who had spent 32 years believing she was superior to me in every way that mattered, stared at me like she was seeing a ghost. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the shock, the confusion, and underneath it all, the dawning realization that everything she thought she knew about our family hierarchy had just crumbled to dust. The wedding could continue now, but nothing would ever be the same. The ceremony proceeded in a haze of barely contained shock. I could feel eyes on me throughout the entire service, some curious, some respectful, some calculating as Boston's social elite recalibrated their understanding of the Blackwood family dynamics. But mostly, I felt Victoria's gaze burning into the back of my head, a mixture of disbelief and something darker that I couldn't quite identify. As Father Mackenzie pronounced Marcus and Isabella husband and wife, I found myself thinking back to the last time I'd been in this cathedral. I was 12 years old, attending my grandmother's funeral, standing between my parents while Victoria clung to my mother's other side like a golden-haired lifeline. Even then, the difference in how we were treated was stark. Victoria got the comfort, the gentle touches, the whispered reassurances. I got the expectation to be strong, to not cry, to somehow understand that death was simply part of life's harsh lessons. "You're too sensitive, Ava," my mother had said when she found me crying behind the church later. "Life isn't going to coddle you the way it does some people. You need to learn to be tougher." Tougher. It had become the family refrain whenever I struggled, whenever I needed support, whenever I dared to suggest that maybe I deserved the same love and attention Victoria received without effort. While my sister got piano lessons and dance classes and summer camps, I got lectures about self-reliance and the importance of not expecting handouts. The irony was that their harsh treatment had indeed made me tougher. It had driven me to excel academically, to work 3 jobs through college, to graduate law school summa cum laude, and catch the attention of federal court clerks who eventually recommended me for judicial appointment. But that success had come at a cost. Complete estrangement from the people who should have been celebrating my achievements. When I'd been nominated for the federal bench at 31, I'd called my parents to share the news. My father's response had been a skeptical. "Are you sure you're ready for that kind of responsibility?" My mother had asked if it paid well, as if money were the only measure of success that mattered. Victoria hadn't called at all, though I'd seen her social media posts about her latest interior design project for a client's yacht. None of them had attended my confirmation hearing. None of them had been there when I took my oath of office. They'd missed the moment when their family disappointment became one of the most powerful jurists in New England, and I'd stopped trying to include them in my life. The reception was held at the Fairmont Copley Plaza, all marble columns and crystal chandeliers, the kind of old-world elegance that Boston's elite used to remind themselves of their importance. I debated leaving immediately after the ceremony, but something kept me rooted in place. Perhaps curiosity about how this revelation would play out, perhaps a masochistic desire to finally see my family's reaction to my success. I found myself standing near the bar, nursing a glass of champagne, and watching the social dynamics shift around me. People who had been ignoring me earlier now approached with careful respect, introducing themselves with titles and accomplishments, clearly hoping to make connections with someone they now understood had significant influence. Judge Blackwood, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, extended his hand. "Thomas Hartley, partner at Hartley, Bass & Associates. We've actually filed several cases in your court." I shook his hand politely, recognizing the name from recent criminal cases. "Mr. Hartley, I trust your clients have been receiving fair hearings." "Absolutely, Your Honor. Your reputation for fairness and thoroughness precedes you." He paused, clearly wanting to say more but uncertain about the appropriateness. "I have to admit, I had no idea you were related to the Castellis." Castellis. My mother's maiden name, the name that carried weight in Boston's construction and real estate development circles, the name that had opened doors for Victoria's interior design business and provided connections that had helped Marcus build his own commercial real estate empire, the name I deliberately distanced myself from in my legal career, choosing to build my reputation on merit rather than family connections. "We're not close," I said simply, watching Victoria across the room as she held court with a group of society wives. She kept glancing my way, her expression unreadable. Mr. Hartley nodded knowingly. "Sometimes the most successful family members are the ones who chart their own course. Your judicial decisions in the Brennan construction fraud case and the Morrison money laundering trial, brilliant work. You've earned quite a reputation for taking on corruption, regardless of who's involved." Something cold settled in my stomach at his words. The Morrison case had involved construction companies with ties to some of Boston's oldest families. The Brennan case had exposed a network of kickbacks and bid rigging that had implicated several prominent business leaders. I'd sent powerful people to prison, people with connections throughout the city's elite circles, people with connections to my own family's business interests. "Excuse me," I said to Mr. Hartley, suddenly needing air. I made my way toward the terrace, my mind racing through recent cases, looking for patterns I might have missed, connections I might have overlooked. But before I could reach the doors, Victoria appeared in front of me, her face flushed with champagne and something that looked like barely controlled panic. "We need to talk," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "Right now." For the first time since we were children, my sister looked genuinely afraid. And somehow, I knew that whatever she was about to tell me was going to change everything. Victoria gripped my arm with surprising strength, her manicured nails digging through the silk of my dress as she steered me toward a secluded alcove behind the hotel's grand staircase. The music and laughter from the reception felt distant here, muffled by heavy curtains and the weight of secrets about to be revealed. How long? She demanded, her voice barely above a whisper but vibrating with intensity. How long have you been a federal judge? 3 years, I replied, studying her face. The sister I remembered was confident, sometimes cruel, but never fearful. This Victoria looked like she was standing on the edge of a precipice, trying to calculate the distance to the bottom. 3 years. She repeated the words like they were a foreign language. And you never thought to mention this to your family? I almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. When would I have mentioned it, Victoria? During one of our regular sister talks? At the family dinners I'm never invited to? Or maybe during one of those heartfelt phone calls where you ask about my life and career? She flinched as if I'd slapped her, but pressed on. This is serious, Ava. Do you have any idea what kind of cases you've been handling? Do you know who you've been? She stopped herself, glancing around nervously. Who I've been sending to prison. I finished for her. Yes, Victoria. I'm quite aware of my job responsibilities. I review every case thoroughly before making decisions. It's called due process. The Morrison case, she said, her voice dropping even lower. The construction fraud ring. You sentenced David Morrison to 15 years. He was laundering money for organized crime families and taking kickbacks on city contracts. He got off light. I watched her face carefully, noting the way she couldn't quite meet my eyes. Why do you care about David Morrison? Victoria's silence stretched between us like a taut wire. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Because Uncle Frank was David Morrison's business partner. The words hit me like a physical blow. Uncle Frank, my mother's brother, the one who'd helped establish the family's construction empire, who'd provided the seed money for Marcus's real estate ventures, who'd been conspicuously absent from every family gathering for the past 2 years. That's impossible, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I was remembering details from the Morrison case. Shell companies with names that had seemed vaguely familiar. Financial transactions that had flowed through businesses I'd heard mentioned at family dinners years ago. Connections I'd dismissed as coincidence because I'd assumed my family's business dealings were legitimate. Frank's been in hiding since the indictments came down, Victoria continued, tears starting to form in her eyes. Mom and Dad have been supporting his wife and kids, trying to keep the family together while he figures out how to handle the situation. Handle the situation? I repeated incredulously. Victoria, if Frank was involved in the Morrison organization, then he was complicit in money laundering, fraud, and God knows what else. There's no handling that situation except through the legal system. You don't understand. She grabbed my hands, her own trembling. It's not just Frank. The businesses, the family money, Marcus's company. It's all connected, Ava. When Frank goes down, he's going to take half the family with him. I pulled my hands away, feeling sick. What are you saying? I'm saying that the judge who's been crusading against corruption in Boston's construction industry is about to discover that her own family is neck deep in the same corruption. Victoria's makeup was starting to run, black streaks of mascara cutting tracks down her cheeks. And when that happens, when people find out you're related to Frank Castelli and you didn't recuse yourself from cases involving his associates, your career is over. Your reputation is destroyed. Everything you've worked for. Stop. The word came out sharper than I intended, cutting through her panic like a blade. Just stop talking for a minute. I needed to think, needed to process what she was telling me. If Frank was indeed connected to the Morrison organization, then my family had been living off criminal proceeds for years. The money that had paid for Victoria's private schools, her design business, Marcus's real estate empire, all of it potentially funded by the very corruption I'd been fighting against in my courtroom. How long have you known? I asked. Known what? Don't play games with me, Victoria. How long have you known about Frank's criminal activities? She looked away, unable to maintain eye contact. We suspected something was wrong about 5 years ago, when he started being more secretive about his business dealings, but we didn't know the full extent until the Morrison investigation started making headlines. 5 years ago, right around the time I'd been appointed to the federal bench, right around the time I'd started presiding over cases involving organized crime and construction fraud. My family had known they were potentially connected to criminal activity, and they'd said nothing. They'd let me unknowingly compromise my judicial ethics while they profited from the very crimes I was prosecuting. You have to recuse yourself, Victoria said urgently, from any cases that might be connected to Frank. I have to uphold my oath, I interrupted. I swore to administer justice without fear or favor, to be impartial regardless of personal consequences. Victoria stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Ava, this will destroy you. When people find out about the family connection, they'll say you were biased, that you were covering for Frank by going after his associates. They'll overturn your convictions, question every decision you've ever made. She was probably right. Judicial ethics required not just actual impartiality, but the appearance of impartiality. Even the hint of a family connection to organized crime could cast doubt on every case I'd handled, every sentence I'd imposed, every decision I'd made from the bench. But as I stood there, watching my sister plead with me to compromise my principles to protect our family's secrets, I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. I wasn't just estranged from my family because of their treatment of me. I was estranged from them because we had fundamentally different different ideas about right and wrong. Victoria, I said quietly, I need you to tell me everything. Every detail about Frank's activities, every family member who might be involved, every business deal that might be compromised. All of it. Why? I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just my sister, but a woman who had benefited from criminal proceeds her entire adult life and was now asking me to help cover it up. Because I'm going to fix this, I said. All of it. The hotel room I'd booked for the night felt like a war room, as Victoria reluctantly began unraveling 20 years of family secrets. She sat on the edge of the bed, still in her emerald dress but with her shoes kicked off and her perfectly styled hair beginning to come undone. I paced by the window, making notes on hotel stationery as she spoke, my legal mind automatically organizing the information into potential charges and evidence trails. It started with Uncle Frank's construction company in the early 2000s, Victoria began, her voice hollow with resignation. He was struggling to compete with larger firms for city contracts, and someone, I don't know who, introduced him to people who could guarantee his bids would be accepted, for a percentage of the profits, I guessed, at first. Then it became more complicated. Money laundering through fake subcontractors, inflated invoices, phantom employees. She rubbed her temples as if trying to massage away a headache. Frank needed clean businesses to funnel the money through. Family businesses. Like what? Victoria's silence stretched long enough that I stopped pacing and turned to face her. She was staring at her hands, twisting her wedding ring around her finger, a tell I remembered from our childhood whenever she was about to confess to breaking something valuable, like Mom's catering company, Dad's consulting firm, Marcus's real estate development business. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. My interior design company. The hotel room suddenly felt airless. I sat down heavily in the desk chair, trying to process what she was telling me. Your business is a front for money laundering? Not a front. It's a real business. I have real clients, real projects. Victoria's defensive tone reminded me of arguments we'd had as children, when she'd been caught doing something wrong but refused to admit the full extent of her guilt. But yes, some of the larger contracts, the ones that came through Frank's connections, those weren't entirely legitimate. I thought about Victoria's lifestyle, the penthouse apartment in Back Bay, the summer house on Martha's Vineyard, the luxury cars and designer clothes and expensive vacations she documented so thoroughly on social media. I'd always assumed her success came from talent and connections, but now I was beginning to understand that it came from something much darker. How much of your income comes from these illegitimate contracts? She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. About 60%. 60%. More than half of my sister's livelihood was built on criminal proceeds. More than half of her life was a lie constructed to hide her family's complicity in organized crime. What about Mom and Dad? Dad's consulting firm provides advisory services to construction companies that need help navigating city regulations. Most of it's legitimate, but he's been paid to facilitate some deals that probably shouldn't have gone through. Victoria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her makeup further. Mom's catering company has been invoicing for events that never happened, parties for companies that exist only on paper. Each revelation felt like another weight added to my chest. My parents, the people who had raised me, who had taught me about right and wrong, who had always emphasized the importance of hard work and integrity, were criminals. Not masterminds, perhaps, but willing participants in a system of corruption that had infected every aspect of their lives. And Marcus? Victoria's expression grew even more pained. Marcus's company has been the primary vehicle for laundering construction profits, fake real estate transactions, inflated property values, shell companies buying and selling properties that don't exist. He's in deeper than any of us. I thought about my cousin, the golden boy of the family, the one who'd graduated from Harvard Business School and built what everyone believed was a legitimate real estate empire, the one who had just married his college sweetheart in a ceremony that probably cost more than most people's houses, the one who was now, according to his own sister, a key player in a money laundering operation. Why are you telling me this, Victoria? I asked. Yesterday, you barely acknowledged my existence. Today, you're confessing your family's crimes to a federal judge. What do you want from me? She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not the condescension or dismissal I was used to, but something that might have been respect mixed with desperation. Because you're the only one of us who isn't compromised, she said. You're the only one who built a life outside of Frank's influence, who achieved success without taking dirty money. You're the only one who might be able to protect us. Protect you from what? From what's coming. Victoria stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Boston skyline. Frank's been trying to negotiate a plea deal with the FBI for months. He's been offering information about his associates, his business partners, his his family members who helped facilitate his operations. The implication hit me like a sledgehammer. He's going to flip. He's going to save himself by destroying everyone else. Mom, Dad, Marcus, me. We're all going to be charged with conspiracy, money laundering, fraud. Everything we've built, everything we've worked for is going to disappear. She turned back to me, and I saw real terror in her eyes. Unless you can find a way to help us. I stood up slowly, feeling like I was moving through water. Victoria, I'm a federal judge. I can't interfere in FBI investigations or criminal prosecutions. Even if I wanted to help, which I'm not sure I do, there's nothing I can do. You could talk to them, explain that we're not really criminals, that we just got caught up in something bigger than we understood. You could vouch for our character, help them see that we're not the real targets they should be pursuing. The desperate hope in her voice was painful to hear. She genuinely believed that I could wave a judicial wand and make their problems disappear, that family loyalty should trump legal obligations, that my position gave me the power and the right to obstruct justice. Victoria, I said gently, I can't do that. I won't do that. Her face crumpled, hope giving way to anger. So you're going to let them destroy us? Your own family? I'm going to let justice take its course, I replied. The same justice I've sworn to uphold for everyone who comes before my court. She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw the exact moment when she realized that I wasn't going to save them, that the sister she'd spent 30 years dismissing as a failure was now the only one with the power to help, and I was choosing not to use it. You've changed, she said, her voice cold with disappointment, and something that might have been hatred. The Ava I knew would have done anything for family. The Ava you knew was a child who desperately wanted to belong, I replied. I grew up. I barely slept that night. By dawn, I was in my chambers at the John Joseph Moakley Courthouse, surrounded by case files and legal precedents, trying to figure out how to navigate the ethical minefield that my family had just dropped in my lap. The morning sun streamed through my office windows, casting long shadows across the law books that had become my sanctuary over the years. My first call was to Chief Judge Patricia Hennessy, the woman who had been both mentor and friend since my appointment to the bench. Patricia had been a federal judge for over 20 years, and if anyone could advise me on the complexities of judicial ethics in family situations, it was her. Patricia, I need to speak with you urgently about a potential conflict of interest, I said when she answered her private line. How urgent are we talking, Ava? The kind that might require me to recuse myself from multiple ongoing cases and potentially compromise several years' worth of judicial decisions. There was a pause. I'll be right over. Patricia arrived within the hour, her gray hair pulled back in its usual severe bun, her expression serious but not unkind. She'd been the first person to take my judicial ambitions seriously, the one who had recommended me for my clerkship and later supported my nomination to the federal bench. If anyone understood the gravity of what I was facing, it was her. I explained everything. Victoria's revelations, the family's involvement in Frank Castelli's criminal enterprise, my potential conflicts in cases involving construction fraud and organized crime. Patricia listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on her legal pad, her expression growing more concerned with each detail. How many cases are we potentially talking about? She asked when I finished. I pulled out a list I'd compiled during my sleepless night. Directly, at least 12 major cases over the past 3 years. Indirectly, if we consider any case involving construction companies or real estate development in the Boston area, possibly dozens more. Patricia reviewed the list, her eyebrows rising as she recognized several high-profile cases. Ava, some of these are landmark decisions. The Morrison case alone sent shockwaves through the construction industry. If there's even a hint that you had undisclosed family connections to the defendants, every conviction gets appealed. Every sentence gets challenged. Every decision I've made gets scrutinized for bias. I completed her thought, having reached the same conclusion during my midnight review of case law. The appearance of impropriety can be as damaging as actual impropriety, Patricia said, quoting one of the fundamental principles of judicial ethics. Even if your decisions were legally sound and factually correct, the perception that you might have been influenced by family considerations could undermine public confidence in the entire judicial system. So what do? Patricia was quiet for several minutes, staring out my office window at the harbor beyond. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard experience. You have several options, none of them good. You can recuse yourself from any future cases involving your family's interests and hope that your past decisions stand up to appeal. You can request a judicial investigation to examine your previous rulings for potential bias. Or, she paused, clearly reluctant to voice the third option, or I can resign from the bench. It might be the only way to prevent a constitutional crisis if appeals courts start overturning your major decisions. 3 years of federal federal criminal cases thrown into doubt because of undisclosed family connections. That's the kind of scandal that destroys public faith in the judiciary. The thought of resignation made me physically ill. I'd worked 15 years to reach this position, sacrificing relationships, financial security, and family connections to build a career based on merit and principle. The idea of giving it all up because my family had chosen crime over integrity was almost unbearable. There might be another option, I said slowly, an idea beginning to form. What if I didn't just recuse myself from future cases? What if I actively cooperated with the federal investigation into my family's activities? Patricia looked at me sharply. That would be unprecedented. A sitting federal judge providing evidence against her own family members? But it would demonstrate that I'm not trying to protect them, that my judicial decisions weren't influenced by family loyalty. It might be the only way to preserve the integrity of my previous rulings. Ava, you're talking about potentially sending your own family members to prison. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Victoria's tearful confession, about Marcus's wedding celebration funded by criminal proceeds, about my parents' decades of willful blindness to the source of their comfortable lifestyle. I thought about all the defendants I'd sentenced over the years, people who'd made similar choices but didn't have a federal judge for a daughter. They made their choices, I said finally. Now I have to make mine. Patricia studied my face for a long moment, and I saw something that might have been admiration in her expression. If you're serious about this course of action, you'll need to contact the FBI immediately. Full disclosure, complete cooperation, no privileged information held back. Even if it destroys my family, especially if it destroys your family. That's the only way you can demonstrate that justice truly is blind, that your judicial decisions weren't compromised by personal relationships. After Patricia left, I sat alone in my chambers for several hours, staring at the phone and trying to summon the courage to make the call that would irrevocably change everything. On my desk was a photograph from my swearing-in ceremony 3 years ago. Me standing alone in my judicial robes, hand raised, taking the oath to administer justice without respect to persons. No family members in the background, no proud relatives celebrating my achievement, just me, alone, promising to uphold the law regardless of personal cost. It seemed fitting somehow that I would be alone when I honored that promise in the most difficult way possible. I picked up the phone and dialed the number Patricia had left me. FBI Boston Field Office. This is Judge Ava Blackwood. I need to speak with someone about the Frank Castelli investigation. I have information that might be useful to your case. The FBI field office in Chelsea was nothing like I'd expected. Instead of the sterile government building I'd imagined, I found myself in a modern facility that could have been mistaken for a corporate headquarters, if not for the armed security guards and metal detectors. Agent Sarah Martinez, who had been assigned to the Castelli case, met me in the lobby with a combination of professional courtesy and barely concealed surprise. Judge Blackwood, she said, extending her hand. I have to admit, when you called yesterday, I thought someone was playing a prank on us. Federal judges don't typically volunteer information about ongoing investigations. Agent Martinez was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of composed manner that suggested she'd dealt with her share of high-profile cases. As she led me through a maze of corridors to a conference room, I found myself wondering how many of my judicial decisions she'd been involved in from the law enforcement side. Before we begin, she said, settling across from me at a polished conference table, I need to make sure you understand the implications of what you're doing. Anything you tell us can and will be used in our investigation. We can't guarantee that your family members won't be prosecuted based on information you provide. I understand, I replied, though the words felt like glass in my throat. I'm here because I have an ethical obligation to disclose potential conflicts of interest in cases I've presided over. Agent Martinez activated a digital recorder and stated the date, time, and participants for the record. Then she opened a thick file folder and spread several photographs across the table, surveillance photos of Frank Castelli meeting with various individuals over the past several years. Let's start with what you know about your uncle's business activities. For the next 3 hours, I provided every detail Victoria had given me and every suspicious family conversation I could remember from the past decade. Agent Martinez took careful notes, occasionally asking for clarification or requesting that I elaborate on specific points. Her expression remained neutral throughout, but I could see her mental wheels turning as she began to understand the scope of the family's involvement. Based on what you've told us, she said during a brief break, it sounds like your family's businesses were essential to Frank Castelli's money laundering operation. Without their cooperation, he couldn't have cleaned the profits from his criminal activities. That's my assessment as well, I agreed. Which means they're not just peripheral figures, they're integral to the conspiracy. Agent Martinez studied me carefully. Judge Blackwood, I have to ask, Why are you doing this? Most people would do everything possible to protect their family members, even if they disagreed with their choices. It was a question I'd been asking myself since making the decision to cooperate. Because my oath as a federal judge requires me to uphold the law without fear or favor. If I try to protect my family from the consequences of their criminal activity, I'm violating that oath and compromising the integrity of every decision I've made from the bench, even if it means sending them to prison. Even then, Agent Martinez made another note, then pulled out a different set of documents. Judge Blackwood, there's something else we need to discuss. Our investigation has uncovered evidence that your family members may not have been entirely passive participants in Frank Castelli's organization. She slid a photograph across the table that made my blood run cold. It showed Marcus and my father meeting with two men I didn't recognize in what appeared to be a parking garage. One of the men was handing my father an envelope while Marcus stood watch. This was taken 6 months ago. Agent Martinez continued, "We believe your father and cousin were receiving instructions for intimidating potential witnesses in the Castelli case." The room seemed to spin around me. Witness intimidation? 3 people who were prepared to testify against Frank Castelli have either changed their minds or disappeared entirely. In each case, they were approached by men matching your father's and Marcus's descriptions, shortly before they recanted their testimony or left town. I stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the image with my memories of my father, the man who had taught me to ride a bicycle, who had insisted on honesty even when the truth was painful, who had always claimed that integrity was more important than success. But the evidence was undeniable. He wasn't just laundering money, he was actively participating in obstruction of justice. "There's more," Agent Martinez said gently, sliding another photograph across the table. This one showed Victoria meeting with a woman I recognized as Lisa Chen, a former bookkeeper for one of the construction companies Frank had been involved with. Lisa Chen was going to provide financial records that would have exposed the full extent of the money laundering operation, Agent Martinez explained. "She met with your sister 3 times in the 2 weeks before she decided not to cooperate with our investigation. We have surveillance footage of your sister giving Ms. Chen an envelope containing $50,000 in cash." The magnitude of my family's criminal involvement was becoming clear. They weren't just passive beneficiaries of Frank's crimes. They were active participants in covering them up, intimidating witnesses, and obstructing justice. Every conversation I'd had with Victoria at the wedding took on new meaning, as I realized she hadn't been asking me to help them avoid prosecution. She'd been asking me to help them avoid consequences for ongoing criminal activity. "Judge Blackwood," Agent Martinez said, her voice taking on a more formal tone, "based on what we've discussed today and the evidence we've gathered, we'll be seeking federal indictments against your parents, your sister, and your cousin within the next 2 weeks. The charges will include conspiracy, money laundering, witness tampering, and obstruction of justice." "All of them?" "All of them." She closed the file folder and leaned back in her chair. "I need to ask, do you have any ongoing contact with your family members? Any scheduled meetings or conversations?" I thought about the dozens of missed calls on my phone from various family members, the urgent text messages I'd been ignoring since leaving the wedding reception. "They've been trying to reach me since yesterday, but I haven't responded to any of their calls." "Good. It's important that you don't warn them about the impending arrests. Even inadvertently, any attempt to tip them off could be construed as obstruction of justice on your part." The irony wasn't lost on me. After 30 years of being excluded from family conversations and decisions, I was now in possession of information that could save them, and I was legally and ethically bound not to share it. Agent Martinez walked me to the lobby, her manner professional, but not unsympathetic. "Judge Blackwood, what you've done today took tremendous courage. I know it wasn't easy to provide evidence against your own family." "No," I agreed, "it wasn't. For what it's worth, your cooperation will help ensure that justice is served not just for Frank Castelli, but for all the legitimate businesses and honest contractors who were pushed out of the market by this criminal conspiracy. Your family's crimes had victims beyond just the government." As I drove back to my apartment in Cambridge, I thought about those victims, the small construction companies that had lost contracts because they couldn't compete with Frank's rigged bids, the city residents who had paid inflated prices for public works projects, the honest contractors who had been forced out of business by a system that rewarded corruption over quality work. My family hadn't just stolen money, they had poisoned an entire industry, undermining fair competition and honest business practices for their own profit. The comfortable lifestyle they'd built was constructed on the ruins of legitimate enterprises and the backs of working people who deserved better. By the time I reached my apartment, I had made peace with my decision. My family had chosen their path years ago when they decided that easy money was more important than honest work. I had chosen mine when I took an oath to uphold justice regardless of personal cost. The next 2 weeks were going to be the most difficult of my life, but I would face them with a clear conscience and the knowledge that I had honored my obligations as both a judge and a citizen. My phone buzzed with another text from Victoria. "Ava, please call me. We need to talk about what happened at the wedding. The family needs your help." I deleted the message without responding. The family would get exactly the kind of help they deserved, the kind that came with handcuffs and Miranda warnings. The arrests happened on a Tuesday morning that dawned gray and drizzling, as if the weather itself understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. I was in my chambers reviewing briefs for the day's hearings when my phone rang with an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Ava? My mother's voice was barely recognizable, high and strained with panic. Ava, they're here. The FBI is at our door with a warrant. They're saying we're under arrest for conspiracy and money laundering. This has to be some kind of mistake. I closed my eyes, fighting against the urge to comfort her, to explain that it wasn't a mistake at all. Mom, you need to call a lawyer immediately. Don't say anything to the agents without legal representation. A lawyer? Ava, I don't understand what's happening. Can't you do something? You're a judge. Surely you can straighten this out. The desperation in her voice was heartbreaking, but I forced myself to maintain professional distance. I can't interfere with an FBI investigation, Mom. You know that. But this is family. Her voice was cut off, replaced by unfamiliar sounds of commotion, authoritative voices reading Miranda rights, my father's shocked protests in the background. The line went dead. Within an hour, I received similar calls from Victoria and Marcus, both from jail-holding cells, both demanding that I use my position to help them. Both calls ended with recriminations and accusations when I explained that I couldn't and wouldn't intervene in their cases. You did this! Victoria had screamed before the call was terminated. You turned us in, didn't you? Your own family. The truth in her accusations stung more than any lie could have. Yes, I had provided information that led to their arrests. Yes, I had chosen justice over family loyalty. And yes, I would make the same choice again, even knowing the cost. By afternoon, the story was all over the local news. Prominent Boston family arrested in federal conspiracy case. Judges' relatives charged in construction fraud ring. Blackwood family scandal rocks Boston elite. The reporters had connected my judicial surname to the arrested Castellis faster than I'd hoped, and my office phone hadn't stopped ringing with requests for comment. Chief Judge Hennessy appeared in my chambers without knocking, her expression grim. Ava, we need to discuss your status on the bench. The media attention alone is going to raise questions about your previous cases. I had been expecting this conversation. I know. I've already prepared my recusal from any cases that might present conflicts of interest going forward. As for past cases, I'm willing to submit to a full judicial review. That might not be enough. Patricia sat down across from my desk, her usual composed demeanor showing cracks of concern. The Attorney General's office called this morning. They're launching an investigation into whether your judicial decisions were influenced by knowledge of your family's criminal activities. I didn't know about their specific crimes until this weekend, I said. Everything I told the FBI was information I learned from Victoria on Saturday night. Can you prove that? The question hung in the air like a sword over my head. How do you prove a negative? How do you demonstrate that you didn't know something until a specific date and time? My family's criminal activities had been ongoing for years, and I had presided over related cases throughout that time period. To outside observers, it would appear impossible that I had remained ignorant of their activities. Patricia, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. I leaned forward, meeting her eyes directly. Do you believe my judicial decisions were compromised by family considerations? She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her mentally reviewing the cases we'd discussed over the years, the legal reasoning behind my major decisions, the consistency of my judicial philosophy across different types of cases. No, she said finally, your decisions have been consistently based on legal precedent and factual evidence. You've been harder on white-collar criminals than most judges, not more lenient. If anything, your judicial record suggests you were overcompensating to avoid any appearance of favoritism. Then why am I being investigated? Because perception matters as much as reality in the judicial system. Because defense attorneys for everyone you've ever convicted are going to claim their clients were denied due process by a biased judge. Because the media loves a scandal, especially one involving a young, successful woman with a dramatic fall from grace. The unfairness of it was breathtaking. I had discovered my family's crimes and immediately reported them to authorities, sacrificing personal relationships to uphold my judicial oath. But instead of being praised for my integrity, I was being punished for my family's choices and my own commitment to justice. What are my options? Patricia opened her briefcase and pulled out several documents. Option 1. You can fight the investigation, maintain your innocence, and hope that a review of your cases vindicates your decisions. This could take years and will be expensive, both personally and professionally. Option 2. You resign from the bench voluntarily, before the investigation concludes, and before defense attorneys have a chance to challenge your major convictions. It would end your judicial career, but it might preserve the integrity of your past decisions. And option 3? There is no option 3, Ava. Not anymore. I stared out my office window at the harbor, watching boats navigate between the islands in the distance. Such a simple process. Identify your destination, plot a course, navigate around obstacles, reach your goal. If only human lives could be steered with such clarity and purpose. If I resign, I said slowly, what happens to the cases I've presided over? They stand as decided, unless individual defendants successfully appeal on other grounds. Your resignation would actually strengthen their legal standing by eliminating any potential claims of judicial bias. And if I fight, then every case becomes vulnerable to appeal, and years of judicial decisions get thrown into doubt. The people you sent to prison, legitimate criminals who deserved their sentences, might go free because of technicalities related to your family situation. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. I could preserve my career and risk undermining justice, or I could sacrifice my career to ensure that justice was served. For someone who had sworn an oath to uphold the law above all other considerations, there was only one acceptable option. I'll need time to prepare my resignation letter, I said. Patricia nodded solemnly. I'm sorry, Ava. You're a brilliant judge, and the system is losing something valuable when you step down. The system is gaining something more valuable, I replied. The assurance that justice was administered fairly, without fear or favor, exactly as I promised when I took my oath. After she left, I sat alone in my chambers for the last time as a sitting federal judge, composing the letter that would end the career I had worked 15 years to build. Outside, the gray morning had given way to afternoon sunshine, and the harbor sparkled with reflected light. Somewhere in that light, I found a kind of peace. The meeting was Margaret Chen's idea. My family's criminal defense attorney thought it would help their cases if I could be convinced to provide character testimony for their sentencing hearings. What she didn't know was that the FBI had asked me to wear a wire to record any attempts at witness tampering or obstruction of justice. We met at a neutral location, a conference room at Margaret's law firm, sterile and corporate, with no personal touches that might remind us we were family. I arrived early, submitting to the FBI technicians who fitted me with recording equipment before Agent Martinez wished me luck and disappeared into a surveillance van parked outside. They came in separately. My parents first, looking older and more fragile than I remembered, followed by Victoria in an expensive suit that couldn't hide the strain around her eyes, and finally Marcus, who couldn't quite meet my gaze as he took his seat at the polished conference table. Margaret Chen was everything I expected from a high-priced criminal defense attorney, elegant, articulate, and utterly ruthless in her pursuit of her client's interests. She had the kind of presence that commanded attention, and I could see why my family had hired her despite the astronomical legal fees. Judge Blackwood, she began, thank you for agreeing to meet with us. I know this situation has been difficult for everyone involved. Former Judge Blackwood, I corrected. I submitted my resignation from the federal bench last week. The words hung in the air like an accusation. My family members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, the reality of what their criminal activities had cost me finally becoming clear. Ava, my father said, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone I remembered from childhood. We need to discuss what happened. This whole situation has gotten completely out of hand. Has it, Dad? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like justice finally caught up with people who thought they were above the law. His face flushed red. We're not criminals, Ava. We made some poor choices, yes, but we're not the kind of people who belong in prison. We're your family. Family. I repeated the word like it was foreign to my tongue. Is that what you call it when you spend 20 years making me feel like an outsider? When you mock my achievements and ignore my successes? When you built your comfortable lifestyle on criminal proceeds while lecturing me about the value of hard work? Victoria leaned forward, tears starting to form in her eyes. Ava, we know we haven't been perfect siblings or parents. We know we've made mistakes, but we're asking for your forgiveness, your help. You're the only one who can vouch for our character, who can help the judge understand that we're not really criminals, aren't you? I asked quietly. Because the evidence suggests that you actively participated in witness intimidation, that you paid bribes to potential witnesses, that you were integral to Frank's money laundering operation for over a decade. Marcus finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. We were trapped, Ava. Once we got involved with Frank's business, we couldn't get out. The people he worked with, they don't let you just walk away. So you decided to drag the whole family deeper instead of going to the authorities? We were protecting everyone, my mother interjected, her voice rising with emotion. If we had exposed Frank's activities, his associates would have come after all of us, including you. We were trying to keep the family safe by committing federal crimes, by intimidating witnesses, by obstructing justice. I stood up, no longer able to sit still while they attempted to justify their choices. You weren't protecting anyone. You were protecting your lifestyle, your social status, your ability to live off criminal proceeds without facing consequences. Margaret Chen held up a hand, clearly concerned about the direction the conversation was taking. Perhaps we should focus on the sentencing phase. Excuse me, Ms. Blackwood. Your family is facing significant prison time. A character statement from you could make the difference between 5 years and 15 years for each of them. I looked around the table at the 4 people who shared my DNA, but had never shared my values. My parents, who had raised me to believe in integrity while building their fortune on corruption. My sister, who had spent decades making me feel inferior while secretly living off criminal profits. My cousin, whose wedding celebration had been funded by money laundering and witness intimidation. You want me to provide character testimony? I asked. Yes, my father said urgently. You know us better than anyone. You know we're not bad people, just people who made bad choices. I do know you, I agreed. I know that when I was 12 years old and broke my arm, you told me to walk it off because life doesn't give you special treatment for being weak. I know that when I graduated summa cum laude from law school, you asked if it was a real achievement or just grade inflation. I know that when I was appointed to the federal bench, none of you attended my swearing-in ceremony. My voice grew stronger as I continued. I know that you spent 20 years making me feel like I didn't belong in this family, and now you expect that same family loyalty to save you from the consequences of your crimes. Victoria was crying openly now. Ava, please. We're sorry. We're genuinely, truly sorry for how we treated you. If you help us through this, things will be different. We can be the family you always wanted us to be. Things will be different because you'll be in federal prison, I replied. And when you get out, if you get out, I hope you'll be different people. People who understand that actions have consequences, that integrity matters more than money, that family means supporting each other's best qualities, not enabling each other's worst choices. Margaret Chen made a note on her legal pad. Ms. Blackwood, I understand you're angry, and you have every right to be, but please consider the impact of your decision. Your family members are facing decades in prison. Your testimony could reduce their sentences significantly. My testimony would be perjury, I said flatly, because the truth is that they are exactly the kind of people who belong in prison. They chose crime over integrity, profit over principle, self-interest over justice. They spent years as active participants in a criminal conspiracy, and they would have continued if they hadn't been caught. I gathered my purse and prepared to leave. If you want character witnesses, find people who actually witnessed good character. Find people who saw acts of integrity, moments of moral courage, examples of putting principle before profit. But don't ask me to lie about who you really are. As I reached the door, my father's voice stopped me. Ava, if you walk out that door, if you refuse to help us, you'll never be welcome in this family again. I turned back to look at him, this man who had raised me but never really known me, who was even now trying to control me with threats and emotional manipulation. Dad, I said softly, I was never welcome in this family to begin with. The difference is that now I don't need your approval to know my own worth. I left them there in their expensive conference room with their high-priced lawyer, planning their defense strategies and calculating their chances. Outside, Agent Martinez was waiting with a satisfied expression. Apparently, my family's attempts at manipulation had been captured clearly on the recording devices. How did it feel? She asked, as we walked toward the federal building. Like finally telling the truth, I replied. After 30 years of trying to earn their love, it felt liberating to stop caring whether they approved of my choices. And the sentencing hearings? They'll have to face those without my help. It's time they learned that actions have consequences, regardless of family connections or personal relationships. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt genuinely free. The sentencing hearings took place over 3 days in October, the courthouse steps crowded with media vans and reporters, eager to document the fall of one of Boston's most prominent families. I wasn't required to attend, but I chose to sit in the gallery anyway, not as a family member offering support, but as a citizen witnessing justice being served. Judge William Morrison presided over the hearings with the kind of gravitas that made me miss my own judicial robes. He was a veteran of the federal bench, someone who had earned respect through decades of fair but firm decisions, and I knew my family couldn't have drawn a better judge if they had wanted someone who would consider all factors before imposing sentence. My parents were sentenced first. Margaret Chen had done her job well, presenting evidence of their community involvement, their charitable contributions, their roles as devoted grandparents to Marcus's children. But Judge Morrison wasn't swayed by the standard defense playbook. Mr. and Mrs. Castelli, he said, using my mother's maiden name that she had legally reclaimed during the proceedings, your criminal activities weren't crimes of passion or desperation. They were calculated decisions made over more than a decade, decisions that enriched your family at the expense of honest businesses and tax-paying citizens. My father received 8 years in federal prison. My mother received received 6, with credit for her lesser role in the witness intimidation schemes. They both wept as the sentences were announced, finally understanding that their comfortable lifestyle had come to a permanent end. Victoria's sentencing was more complex because of her active role in bribing potential witnesses. The prosecution presented evidence of 3 separate instances where she had offered money to people who might testify against Frank, successfully preventing cooperation with federal investigators. Ms. Castelli, Judge Morrison said, his voice carrying disappointment along with authority, you weren't just a passive beneficiary of criminal proceeds. You actively worked to obstruct justice, to prevent witnesses from cooperating with law enforcement, to help a criminal organization continue its illegal activities. Victoria received 12 years, the longest sentence of any family member except Frank himself. As the marshals led her away in handcuffs, she looked back at me one last time, her expression a mixture of hatred and desperation that I knew would haunt my memory for years to come. Marcus's sentencing was the most difficult for me to watch. Despite everything, I retained fond memories of our childhood together, of the cousin who had been like an older brother before family dynamics and criminal choices drove us apart. His defense attorney painted him as a reluctant participant, someone who had been coerced into money laundering activities by fear of his uncle's criminal associates. Judge Morrison wasn't entirely unsympathetic to this argument, but the evidence of Marcus's active participation was too strong to ignore. Mr. Castelli, you held a Harvard MBA and ran a successful real estate business. You understood exactly what you were doing when you created shell companies to launder criminal proceeds. You made a conscious choice to benefit from illegal activities. Marcus received 10 years, with a recommendation for minimum security prison, given his cooperation with investigators and lack of prior criminal history. His wife, Isabella, who had been granted immunity in exchange for her testimony about the family's money laundering activities, sat in the front row holding their infant daughter, her face a mask of devastation. Frank Castelli's sentencing had taken place the previous month. In exchange for his cooperation against other organized crime figures, he had received 25 years, effectively a life sentence for a man in his 60s. He would die in federal prison, but his testimony would help prosecutors dismantle several criminal organizations that had been operating in Boston for decades. After the final sentencing, I found myself standing outside the courthouse in the autumn sunshine, watching my family members being transported to begin their prison terms. Reporters approached me for comment, but I declined to make any statements beyond expressing confidence that justice had been served. Agent Martinez appeared beside me as the media crowd began to disperse. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "Better than I expected," I replied honestly. I thought I'd feel guilty or sad, but mostly I feel relieved. Relieved that it's over, that the truth is finally out, that they can't hurt anyone else with their criminal activities. I watched the last prison transport van disappear around the corner. For the first time in my adult life, I don't have to worry about what my family is doing behind closed doors. Agent Martinez nodded understandingly. "What will you do now? I heard you turned down several offers from law firms." I had indeed received job offers, lucrative positions at prestigious firms that would have traded on my notoriety and my knowledge of federal judicial procedures. But the thought of returning to corporate law, of defending the kind of white-collar criminals I had spent years sending to prison, held no appeal. "I'm starting my own practice," I said. "Legal aid work mostly, helping people who can't afford quality representation, working with victims of white-collar crime to recover their losses." That's a significant change from being a federal judge. Maybe, but it feels like the right way to honor the oath I took when I first became a lawyer, to use my skills in service of justice, not just in service of whoever can afford my fees. Agent Martinez smiled. "I think you're going to make a difference, Ms. Blackwood. It takes courage to choose principle over profit, family loyalty over personal advancement." "I had good teachers," I replied, thinking of Judge Hennessy and the other mentors who had shown me that integrity was more valuable than comfort, that doing the right thing was more important than being popular. As I walked back to my car, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I had been a federal judge with a promising career, estranged from my family, but comfortable in my isolation. Today, I was unemployed, alone, and facing an uncertain future, but I was also free from the weight of family secrets and personal compromises. The woman who had been humiliated at Marcus's wedding was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth independently of family approval or social status. The judge who had unknowingly presided over cases involving her own family's crimes had been replaced by an advocate who had spent her career fighting for people who deserved justice but couldn't afford it. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was the life my principles demanded, and for the first time in 30 years, that felt like enough. 1 year later, I stood in the cramped office space I'd rented in a converted warehouse in South Boston, surrounded by boxes of legal files and secondhand furniture that looked nothing like my former judicial chambers. The sign on my door read, "Blackwood Legal Aid Services," and it represented every everything I had become since walking away from the federal bench. My first client of the day was Maria Santos, a single mother whose wages had been stolen by a construction company with ties to the same criminal network my family had been part of. She sat across from my desk, clutching a folder of pay stubs and timesheets, her face showing the exhaustion that came from working 2 jobs while trying to recover money she was legally owed. "They say I wasn't a full-time employee," she explained in accented English, "but I worked 40 hours every week for 6 months. When I asked for overtime pay, they fired me and said I was an independent contractor." I reviewed her documentation, recognizing the classic signs of wage theft: misclassification of employees to avoid paying benefits, illegal deductions from paychecks, failure to pay overtime compensation. It was exactly the kind of exploitation that thrived in industries corrupted by organized crime, where legitimate workers were squeezed to maximize profits for criminal organizations. "Maria," I said, "we're going to get your money back, all of it, plus penalties and interest, and we're going to make sure this company can't do this to other workers." The relief on her face reminded me why I had chosen this path. As a federal judge, I had administered justice from a distance, imposing sentences on criminals who appeared before my bench in suits and ties. But here, working directly with victims of white-collar crime, I could see the human impact of the corruption I had spent years fighting. My practice had grown steadily over the past year, fueled by referrals from legal aid organizations and word-of-mouth recommendations from clients whose cases I had successfully resolved. I specialized in employment law violations, consumer fraud, and civil rights cases, the kinds of legal problems that affected working families, but were often ignored by large law firms focused on more profitable matters. The work paid less than a tenth of what I had earned as a federal judge, but it provided something more valuable than money: the satisfaction of fighting for people who genuinely needed an advocate, of using my legal skills to level playing fields that had been tilted against ordinary citizens. My phone rang as Maria was leaving, and I recognized the number as belonging to Patricia Hennessy, my former chief judge who had become one of my most valued references and friends. "Ava," Patricia's warm voice filled my small office. "I have some news I think you'll want to hear. The Third Circuit Court of Appeals just issued their decision in the Morrison case." I held my breath. The Morrison money laundering case had been one of my most significant rulings as a federal judge, and it had been under appeal since my family's arrests had raised questions about potential judicial bias. "The conviction stands," Patricia continued. "The appellate court found no evidence that your judicial decisions were influenced by personal considerations. They specifically noted that your sentencing in the case was harsher than what most judges would have imposed, suggesting that you were, if anything, overcompensating to avoid any appearance of favoritism." Relief flooded through me. The Morrison case had been a bellwether for all of my major judicial decisions. If it had been overturned due to perceived bias, dozens of other cases might have followed. But the appellate court's ruling meant that my judicial legacy would stand, that the criminals I had sent to prison would remain there, that justice had indeed been served fairly, despite my family connections. "There's more," Patricia said. "Judge Morrison is retiring next month, and there's talk in Washington about finding a replacement who has experience with complex white-collar crime cases. Your name has been mentioned. Patricia, I resigned from the bench. I can't just return as if nothing happened. You resigned to preserve the integrity of your judicial decisions and to avoid any appearance of impropriety. The investigation cleared you of any wrongdoing, and your voluntary resignation is now seen as evidence of your commitment to judicial ethics, rather than an admission of guilt. The possibility of returning to the federal bench was tempting. I missed the intellectual challenges of constitutional law, the satisfaction of writing decisions that would shape legal precedent, the authority that came with judicial robes. But I also thought about Maria Santos and the dozens of other clients who depended on my advocacy, people who would have no voice in the legal system without attorneys willing to work for modest fees and just causes. "I'm flattered that my name is being considered," I told Patricia, "but I think I'm exactly where I need to be. Are you sure? This would be a chance to reclaim everything you gave up, to return to the career you worked so hard to build." I looked around my modest office, at the files representing workers who had been cheated, consumers who had been defrauded, tenants who had been exploited by unscrupulous landlords. This wasn't the career I had planned, but it was the career that allowed me to sleep soundly at night, knowing that I was fighting for justice rather than just administering it. "Patricia, a year ago I thought success meant presiding over a courtroom, wearing judicial robes, having my decisions cited in law reviews, but I've learned that real success means using whatever talents you have to make the world a little more just, a little more fair, regardless of titles or recognition. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Patricia spoke again, her voice carried a note of admiration. "You know, Ava, I think you've become a better lawyer and a better person than you ever were as a judge." After ending the call, I walked to my office window and looked out at the busy street below. Workers were heading home from their jobs, students were walking to evening classes, families were going about the ordinary business of their lives. None of them knew that a former federal judge was working in the building above them, fighting cases that would never make headlines but would determine whether they could afford rent, whether they would be paid fairly for their work, whether they would be treated with dignity by landlords and employers and government agencies. My family was still in federal prison, serving their sentences for crimes that had enriched them for over a decade. I had received exactly 2 letters from them in the past year, both from my mother, both asking if I had reconsidered my decision not to provide character testimony for their appeals. I had not responded to either letter. The woman who had been humiliated at Marcus's wedding, the woman who had desperately wanted her family's approval and acceptance, was gone. In her place stood someone who had learned that self-respect was more valuable than family harmony, that integrity was more important than comfort, that sometimes the greatest act of love was refusing to enable destructive behavior. My phone rang again, this time with a call from a new client, a construction worker who had been injured on the job and was being pressured to accept a settlement that wouldn't cover his medical expenses. I grabbed a legal pad and prepared to take notes, already planning the research I would need to do, the arguments I would make, the justice I would fight to secure. It wasn't the life I had expected, but it was the life I had chosen, and for the first time since I could remember, that was exactly enough. Outside my window, the sun was setting over Boston Harbor, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in that light, I imagined I could see the future. Not the future I had planned, but the future I was building. One case at a time, one client at a time, one act of justice at a time. I was Ava Blackwood, former federal judge, current legal aid attorney, and finally, completely myself.